and that's the home kit camera. I've been checking off the items as I've unpacked the home kit against the contents checklist, and we advise you to do the same. Now, we've got everything here spread out on the table, and what we're going to do in this program is to show you some of the main items and some of the smaller items in the home kit, and illustrate some of the basic techniques that you'll be using throughout the course. And we've decided to devote a whole program to the home kit because in this course it really does form a central and very crucial role. But anyway, let's start off by looking at some of the larger items that we've sent you.
And I'll make a bet that the first item you got out was the laser. After all, it is rather unusual to have a laser in the home kit. I've just finished wiring it up, so if I put the plug in, just make sure it's working. Yes, there's the beam. A nice, parallel, narrow beam. We'd like you to take sensible precautions with this laser beam. You see, the problem is that it's very narrow and very parallel, so when it goes into your eye, although the power of the laser is only about 0.5 milliwatt, you can focus it down onto a very, very small spot on the retina, so the power density can be enormously high. And if you keep it there for more than about 5 seconds, it can actually do some damage. Mind you, having said that, if you can bear it for 5 seconds, you've got to be a masochist.
And of course, you don't really actually need to look right down the beam to get this damaging effect. I mean, reflection off a lens or a mirror will be just as bad, won't it?
Yeah, I think generally avoid the undiverged laser beam.
Right. Well, as well as the laser, we've sent you some other large items. There was this camera I was unpacking at the beginning. And as well, we've sent you another sort of light source. It's actually an ordinary tungsten lamp, which we've put in a nice box. And there's a tungsten lamp inside there. You'll be using this light source at various times throughout the course. Another thing we've sent you is this little box of optical components here. There we are. Now, this is really rather an exciting little device because it enables you to make holograms at home in units 9 and 10. That's really rather exciting, making holograms at home.
And that, of course, is what these little chess pieces are for. They're not for playing chess with. Essentially, they're going to be the objects in the holobox there.
And as well, we have sent you a professionally made hologram, which you will reconstruct using the laser, and these instructions are given as appropriate throughout the course.
Okay, what else have we got? Well, we've got a couple of trays here of all sorts of odds and ends. These big pieces are saddles, and you mount them on the optical bench like so, screw them up. You can position them anywhere you like and then clamp them. And into the saddles, we can put the optical pillars. These are the optical pillars. You go straight in, again tighten them up, you can adjust the height and put any sorts of components in the top here. What else have we got in the box? Oh yes, a couple of razor blades. These razor blades are not for sharpening your pencils with. There's a little magnetic ring magnet here, and if you put the razor blades on them, they stay in place, and you see you can actually form your own slits in that way, make them adjustable as well.
Now, we've sent you some other smaller components which are in this other tray, and there are some diffraction masks here, little slides of various objects that you'll be using, and also we've sent you a range of lenses. Now, these lenses are marked by means of a letter up in one of the corners, and the letter serves to identify the lens, and you can look up in the home kit handbook the diameter and the focal length of the lens. However, if you're at all dubious about the focal length of the lens, it's easily checked. You select some distant light source, I'm going to use a studio light, and you form an image of it. I'm going to use my hand as a screen, and vary the distance until I get a sharply focused image. There, that'll do. And now the distance between the lens and my hand is roughly equal to the focal length of the lens.
Okay, those are all convex lenses in the little square plastic mounts there, but in addition, there are a couple of concave lenses, diverging lenses, and perhaps this one is the most important of the lot. This is a very small one. It's mounted again in a ring magnet, and we've done that because you can then locate it right on the end of the laser. If I turn the laser on now, by shifting the position about, I get a diverging beam coming down the bench.
But in fact, a diverging beam isn't particularly useful to us, is it?
Well, no. More often what we're trying to do is produce a parallel beam, but bigger in diameter than the original parallel beam. And that's where the convex lenses come in. If I take that lens you just had a second ago, if I shove that in here, you see, then this diverging light is brought back again by this convex lens. And if I adjust the position properly, then I can get the beam to come out parallel the moment it's focusing. So I've got to go back in this direction. In fact, as long as it focuses a fair way down the optical bench, you don't need to be too precise about this. It's then converging, which to all intents and purposes is more or less parallel.
And in fact, we've outlined the principle of what's going on very briefly in a little booklet in the home kit, very useful little booklet, the home kit handbook, which you must look at. And there's a diagram there which shows the action of a beam broadener. You can see the little concave lens here and the convex lens over there, beam that breadth going in, wider going out. Now, were we to select a lens of shorter focal length for the convex lens, we'd have to place it closer in order to get a nice parallel beam going out, and the beam would then also be narrower. So we can vary the width of the beam coming out by using lenses of different focal lengths.
Because it's not just a matter of getting it parallel, we also want it to go nicely down the optical bench. And in fact, if you've had any difficulties with the lens here, you can pat it out with glue tack or something to get it nice and level. In fact, you can see the effect. Perhaps, Barry, if you could move it around for me.
Okay, now I'm going to move the lens sideways, and I think you can see that the beam is tending to move sideways as well. And if I move it up and down, you can see that the beam is also moving up and down. So I'll try to get it more or less above the optical bench and more or less the right height. There we are.
Right. And the rule is every time you put in another component, make sure it does the same sort of thing. Then you know that the optic axis, as defined by the laser beam, comes down exactly the centre of all the components.
Now there's one other large component that we haven't yet mentioned. Let me move that out of the way, and it's the photometer. Now a photometer is used to measure light intensities, and the home kit photometer comes in two parts. Pop that bit up there. This is the light sensitive device. There's a little diode in the middle there which is actually sensitive to light. Be careful of it, it's rather fragile. And this little photodiode feeds this box of electronics, and the meter there gives you the light intensity reading. Now the first thing you have to do is to put batteries into this, and let's have a look, see if we've done that. And indeed we have two PP6 batteries in there. To check that the batteries are all right, there's a battery check on the front, this knob here, and indeed the needle goes up into the green sector, and that means the batteries are fine. It's now ready to be used as a light meter, so let's plug it in.
Red to red and black to black.
Right, that's important. I'm going to get that the wrong way around. Now, I'm going to switch it on to the least sensitive range, and this is the knob that we use for doing that. There are many ranges, and if you switch it on to the least sensitive one, you're affording the maximum protection should the light be very bright. The full-scale deflection is 1,000 microamps on the scale. So let's switch it on and see what we've got in the studio. Not very much, the needle hardly moved. Let's go to a more sensitive scale, more sensitive scale, more sensitive. Oops, that was a little bit too much, wasn't it? There we are. And if I cover up the device, you can see that the signal falls in that manner there. There's a couple of other things on the controls here. There's this knob marked 0. That's for backing off any stray light. Now, we really would like you to make sure that stray light is as small as possible, as little as possible stray light around. But should there be a little bit of remnant stray light, then that adjusting knob there enables you to back it off and reset the meter to 0.
Perhaps you ought to mention the calibration knob as well.
Oh, that's this here, yes.
Yeah. Why don't we actually calibrate that
Yes,
thing?
let's calibrate the device. This is in order to ensure that all of you are working with the meter set up more or less the same as each other, and just as important, the same as us when we were designing these experiments.
What I'm doing is I'm putting the sensitive device right in the neat laser beam.
You've taken the beam broadener off?
Yes, I've taken the beam broadener off. It's a bit tricky to align and get the height right first of all. And now I adjust it for position somewhere around about there. What sort of reading are we getting?
We're getting a reading of about 450, little under. We recommend you twiddle the knob until you get a reading of about 500. There, it's not too accurate. I mean, the lasers themselves vary by plus or minus 10–20%, but that'll do.
But then we actually know that you're all getting the same sort of intensity readings when we say set it to any particular value on there.
Indeed. Well, now we want to use this photometer to help us carry out an experiment. Now, this is one of the experiments that you'll be doing in Unit 2 in a week or two's time, and we've set it up over there. Can I have the device? Thank you very much. Here we are. You can see it's ready set up. We had a second home kit available, which has enabled us to do that. Basically, the experiment is to make a series of known exposures on photographic film. The film is mounted here in the camera, and the known exposures are determined by this lamp here and by the settings on the camera itself. Now the first step is to load the film into the camera, so let's do that. First of all, note that at the bottom of the camera, at the base, there's this, this bracket, this angle bracket, which you'll find in the home kit. Now to open the camera, all you have to do is to slide this little clip down at the side, and there we are. And you can see that I've actually already mounted a film in. This is quite a straightforward process. But in fact, what is very important is that you choose the correct film for the job. You have to use ASA 125 film. The speed of the film must be ASA 125 because the whole experiment has been designed around that. Now, as well, you must ensure that you use 20 exposures in the cassette. Our processing really doesn't work very well on 36 exposures. And of course, it must be 35mm film. But apart from that, it doesn't really matter what brand of film you use, as long as you make sure that it really is ASA 125 and ignore any other numberings that the manufacturer might give. And here is a sample of some films that you can use for the job, but not this one on the end. This is holographic film used in Units 9 and 10, which we actually send in the home kit. Now, I mounted it in there, so let me close the back of the camera and wind on that exposed part of film. I certainly don't want to use that. So here's the film wind-on knob. Wind on as far as it'll go. Cock the shutter. Expose, wind on. I don't want to use that one either. Cock the shutter, wind on, cock the shutter, expose the film. I don't want to use that one either. Playing safe, you see. There we are. That's another frame wound on. Cock the shutter and expose that one. Now I do want to start the experiment proper, and the first thing to do is to put a marker frame onto the film so that you've got some object that you can identify. And in fact, I'm going to use Keith as an identifiable object. And let me set the camera for the studio conditions. That'll do. And wind on. Don't forget to cock the shutter. Do this in a very methodical order to make sure you don't forget anything. Thank you. And now I'm ready to make the exposures. But where do I place the camera? Obviously, the closer to the light source, the greater the exposure range I'm going to end up with on the film. Now, to determine where I'm going to place the camera, we've designed the experiment, and we know that a suitable light intensity at the lens is when the reading on the photometer is equal to 1 microamp. So let me set the photometer up there, switch it on, switch on the light source, and place a piece of diffuser in here, just a piece of paper, which gives me a nice uniform object, a uniformly lit object to photograph. And adjust the distance until the reading is about what I want it to be, about 1 microamp. In fact, the studio lights are really rather bright, and in practice you'd have to be very careful to exclude stray light. But that sort of distance will do. Now we want to place the camera lens there, so I'll take this away and move the camera lens up to about where the photometer head was. Now I'm ready to take the series of exposures. The first exposure is the longest. It's 100 seconds time exposure with the lens fully open. So let me set the speed to B, position B, which is time exposure. That's there. And let me set the aperture at the front of the lens to f4, which makes it fully open, which is there. Now I'm ready to take the exposure. Oh, don't forget, wind on. I've done that. Cock the shutter and time the exposure. Well, I'm not going to hold this down for 100 seconds. You get the idea. There we are. That was 100 seconds, let's say. And then you go on working by lowering the exposure time until you're right through to the shortest exposure time you can get on this camera, which is a 250th of a second. Let's suppose we've got to that point. 250th of a second. Still with the lens fully open. We wind on the film, cock the shutter, and expose. And now to get a smaller exposure still, we have to narrow down the aperture on the front of the lens. So let me do that. And we do this in stages. It's on f4 at the moment. We'd go right down through the range, end up on f16, which is there. Wind on the film again, cock the shutter, and make the exposure. One further exposure, wind on the film. Don't cock the shutter this time. It's a 0 exposure, so we can tell something about the film when it hasn't been exposed. There, I've made it. And finally, we end up with another marker frame, so let me reset this for the studio. That'll do it. Wind on the film, cock the shutter, and make the exposure. There we are. Now we have to rewind the film and then unload the camera and process the film. In order to rewind the film, you have to pull out this knob at the top, like that, and press the shutter button, shutter release button like that, keep it depressed, and rewind the film like this. Turning it clockwise in the direction of the arrow as indicated. I think you can see that wheel there, that metal wheel is rotating backwards. That's the film counter ring, and when that stops rotating, that's the moment to stop rewinding, because then you're onto that narrow film leader at the beginning of the film. If you overdo it and shoot right past that point, you can end up with the film completely wound into the cassette, and then you'll have to take it to a chemist or grope around under the bedclothes or something in order to get the film back out again. So you keep a good eye on that film counter ring rotation. There we are. You see now I'm rotating and no further motion of the film counter ring. I know I've reached the point where I must stop and open up the camera. Knob at the side. There we are. Properly rewound. Take it out. And now we need to develop the film. This is really rather an important process to get right. You don't only develop film in Unit 2, but you also develop film when you're making holograms in Units 9 and 10. But even though it's rather an important process, it fortunately isn't a particularly difficult one.
Well, I think the thing to do is to collect all together the things we're going to be using. So here's the developer, the twiddling stick, and the beaker. The first thing is to cut off the extra film at the end. So I'm going to pull it out so I can cut off the leader and about an inch of the ordinary film, leave about half an inch, bend it back over the cassette, put a nice sharp bend in there, and then hold that firmly with an elastic band. I've got an elastic band here. Wrap it around a couple of times, keep it, 3 times I think, keep it nice and firm. So that's the cassette ready for development. Now I've got to prepare the developer. The developer's not particularly dangerous, but I've got a pair of kitchen gloves here just to stop it from doing any harm at all to my hands. It's slightly alkaline. Take my watch off. I'll get it on the right hand. I'm going to dilute the developer about 1:1. This particular developer needs diluting like that. So I'm going to about 1/3 fill the beaker with developer, and then I'm going to add another 1/3 or so of water. Now I've been keeping the water at room temperature. I've got some milk bottles here which have been sitting around the studio all day, and I'm going to put this back into the beaker, so bring it up to, notice it went a bit cloudy, give it a quick whisk around with a stirrer. And of course when I drop the cassette in, the cassette will take up the extra volume. So I'm going to drop that in now, and as I do I begin to see the odd air bubble come up. Yes, that indicates that the air has been expelled from the cassette. I now insert the fork in the top and I rotate fully anti-clockwise. Well, actually I can't go much further, so I'm now going to rotate clockwise, counting the number of turns. There's a little marker on the twiddling stick which allows me to count them, so that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I'm now feeling tension. Now it means that the film is wound fully against the case of the cassette. So let me wind back in the other direction again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and now it's fully tightened on the spool. I now want to operate in the position halfway between those two so that the film's nice and loose. So I'm going to count like 1, 2, and a bit. That also had the benefit of expelling any extra air that was in the cassette. Now I just have to twiddle. 1 or 2 points. You need to twiddle about this sort of speed between your finger and thumbs. You need to do it for about 15 minutes. Don't worry if you do it longer, it won't do any harm if you do it longer, but make sure it's at least that time. It's also worth making sure that you've got the level of the developer well over the top of the cassette, if necessary spilling over, so that it can freely get into the cassette. Yeah, the other thing, of course, if you find it getting taut, it's because the film's swelling, so count back the 2.5 turns, as I just did there, and carry on twiddling. Well, it's just another 15 minutes from now, so I'm timing. Well, we're just coming up to the 15-minute mark now. Actually, the thing which gives me the most confidence is the fact that the developer's got a terribly murky green colour. And of course, we didn't expose very many of these frames, so there's an awful lot of salt to get off this particular film. Anyway, I'm going to call that it. I take the cassette out, just drain it a little bit, and throw the developer down the sink. Now, I've got to wash the film, so this is where I bring in my trusted coffee mug. I'm not drinking coffee out of it now, of course. I need to fill this up with the same water that I was using before, namely water at the same temperature. So, just pour it in, and take the elastic band off the cassette. A bit tricky with wet fingers. There we go. Pull it out. Goodness. There we are. And a sharp tug should get it off the end. If you have any problems getting it off the end, just cut it off. Now, we've got to wash it. And the way to wash it is to stretch the film like this, then run it through the water. This takes years of experience. Don't worry, by the time you finish this course, you'll be as good at it as we are. Now, you want to run it through about half a dozen times, and you really want to change your water 4 times at least. Better to use a little bit of water, a mug full of water, lots of times, than to have a lot of water there. Well, I'm not going to go through all the washing procedures. It means I just want it as clean as I ought to. But to save time, I'm going to pretend that this next washing session is the last one. So, empty the dirty water away, fill up again with clean water from the milk bottle. Now, if this is the last washing, you want to add 1 drop of washing up liquid. And when I say 1 drop, I really do mean 1 drop. See if I can do it. Whoops. If you put too much in, then all that happens is the water will go soap and it won't serve any purpose at all. The idea is that that little drop of washing up liquid will wet the film nicely and give you a nice clean drying. You won't get drying marks on it. Now, I'm going to run through it again, up and down. Get it nice and clean. I can still see salt coming off in the water. The water's still going dirty, so obviously I should have washed it a lot more than I have done. However, I think you can see the basic effect. You can clearly see there's some frames at the top. I'll wipe it down, and I've got to hang it up to dry. And the trick I use is, bent paper clip just here. I just put the paper clip through one of the perforations and hang it on a hook. Any old hook will do. To weight it down, bulldog clip or anything like that stuck on the bottom to keep it nice and straight. Then leave it there to dry. And I think you can see that they've definitely got some frames at the top there. You can see the marker frame of me. Of course, you have to leave it to dry now. It takes a while to dry. And in fact, you've already got one that's dried, haven't you?
Yes, I have indeed. And this was a film I exposed actually at home and not in a laboratory. At the top, you can see the marker frames, and then lower down, there are the exposures proper. Well, there is a good deal more to the experiment than that, but we're not going to do it here because this program has not been about a particular experiment, but about the home experiments kit. And certainly we on the course team hope that you really do enjoy doing the home experiments.
In a